So today's presentation is going to be on the origins of the priesthood ban. This is kind of a presentation I actually put together back in January of this year, so almost 9 months ago. But I didn't feel, like bringing it up at the time, but there's been recent controversies in fundamentalism over this issue, and it's something that is an important doctrine to understand because Brigham Young and the other early brethren treated this as an important issue. I know it's a difficult subject for a lot of people, but I do think that um, it's good to know all of the historical evidence. I think that the historical evidence is overwhelming that this doctrine started with Joseph Smith and wasn't something that Brigham Young made up. There's been, you know, historians in general have adopted a newer view that Brigham Young decided to institute the ban sometime between 1847 and 1849, but that that Joseph Smith never taught it or had it in his lifetime, and so it was something that Brigham Young decided to be an uninspired racist is kind of the historical consensus. But if you come from a fundamentalist perspective, you are more cautious with jumping to conclusions like that. And fundamentalists in a lot of ways believe that Brigham Young, as Joseph Smith's legitimate successor, his teachings were a legitimate continuation of Joseph Smith's teachings. But this issue is something in which the historical community generally does not think that's the case. And I think Lester Bush did a pretty good paper arguing that position. Like I'm not going to say that it's a terrible paper. I disagree with his conclusions, but I do think he put together a significant amount of evidence to support his view. But there's been new evidence that's come out since that time that I think needs to be also weighed. And so this presentation is just going to be a brief overview of all the different evidence that I think that Lester Bush failed to weigh in his presentation, and that I think is compelling evidence that the ban and the racial doctrines that Brigham Young taught had their origins with Joseph Smith. So to start off, Joseph Smith's revelations and teachings are the ones that fundamentalists will point to the most. Book of Moses, Book of Abraham have some pretty explicit racial ideas in them. Moses 7:22, as an example, says, "And Enoch beheld the residue of the people, which were the sons of Adam, and they're a mixture of all the seed of Adam, save it were the seed of Cain, for the seed of Cain were black and had not place among them." Abraham 1:26-27 says, "Pharaoh, being a righteous man, established his kingdom and judged his people wisely and justly all his days, seeking earnestly to imitate that order established by the fathers in the first generations, in the days of the first patriarchal reign, even in the reign of Adam, and also of Noah his father, who blessed him with the blessings of the earth and with the blessings of wisdom, but cursed him as pertaining to the priesthood. Now Pharaoh, being of that lineage by which he could not have the right of priesthood, notwithstanding the Pharaohs would fain claim it from Noah through him, therefore my father was led away by their idolatry." So it's interesting. It says that Noah, his father, because Pharaoh was a righteous man, he blessed him with the blessings of wisdom and blessed him with the blessings of this earth, but cursed him pertaining to the priesthood. Now, why would he curse him pertaining to the priesthood? Well, the next verse says, "Now Pharaoh, being of the lineage by which he could not have the right of priesthood." So I think the verse is pretty straightforward, and I know that there are people who will try to wiggle out of and say you can interpret it a different way, but I think the most straightforward reading of these verses is that there is a lineage that did not have the right of the priesthood. So, and then Joseph Smith interestingly said, and so Abraham 1 says that the seed of Ham and the Canaanites preserved the curse that existed before the flood, what's in the earlier verses of Abraham. And so what's interesting is Joseph Smith in the April 1836 issue of the Messenger and Advocate said, "But I can say that this curse is not yet taken off the sons of Ham, neither will it be until it is affected by his great power has caused it to come. And the people who interfere the least with the decrees and purposes of God in this matter will come under the least condemnation before him." So Joseph Smith there was saying that the curse was not yet taken off the sons of Canaan. And some people will try to say that was just referencing slavery based off of the curse that that Noah placed on Canaan was to be a servant of servants. But Joseph Smith's revelation in Abraham 1:26-27 says that it's also priesthood. So, you can't just segregate these two different aspects of Joseph Smith's teachings. So, the second reason I can think it's compelling that the priesthood ban started with Joseph Smith is that there were 1845 statements by the apostles on this subject. And this flies in the face of those who try to say that Brigham Young didn't and the other apostles didn't adopt these ideas until 1847 to the early Utah period, 1849 to 1852. They won't even pinpoint an exact date. They just want to say it's some time later, but look at these very early sources. So many statements can be found in 1845 teaching different aspects of the priesthood ban's theology less than a year after Joseph Smith's death. Brigham Young on January 8th, 1845 taught, quote, "I have received a promise that is to remain with me and my seed, and the same will be upon you and your children. I will tell your children that inasmuch as you've received this promise, then if you mix your blood with others, I will curse you in relation to the priesthood. You will be cursed or condemned. If the ancients had not mixed their blood, the priesthood would never have been taken from them." So then Brigham Young would make other statements about how the right to hold the priesthood was connected to lineage of blood on March 9th, 1845, June 5th, 1845, and then also on February 16th, 1847. So another interesting thing, and this was in the recently released Council of 50 Minutes, published in 2016. Brigham Young invited Orson Hyde to teach that less valiant spirits were cursed for their actions in the pre-existence to the Council of 50 on March 22nd, 1845, indicating Brigham either endorsed or was open to these ideas. So the minutes read, "The chairman, Brigham Young, called upon Elder Orson Hyde to relate to the council the story of how the Negroes come, on which Counselor Orson Hyde stated that I told them that in the council of heaven, when Satan rebelled, there were some who took an active part in the rebellion, but yet were too cowardly to be leaders in the rebellion with Lucifer and others. The leaders in the rebellion were hurled from heaven to hell, were doomed to remain without bodies. But the others whose crimes were not so great were cursed with blackness and became black spirits. When Cain murdered his brother Abel on the earth, the Almighty cursed him and put a mark on him, or rather turned him black to give the black spirits a chance to come and take bodies like themselves. And the black spirits, taking the black bodies, made the Negroes." So the third point I would bring up is that there was a lack of controversy about the ban. There are some people who mistakenly try to say that Orson Pratt opposed the ban. Everything I've seen, however, from Orson Pratt shows that he supported it and he wasn't opposed to it. In the Seer in April of 1853, he teaches it, and then also his brother Parley P. Pratt also made statements supporting the ban. So in the Seer, Orson Pratt said, "Some spirits take bodies in the lineage of the chosen seed through whom the priesthood is transferred. Others receive bodies among the African Negroes or the lineage of Canaan, whose descendants were cursed pertaining to the priesthood." So then his brother, Parley P. Pratt, was the very first person to make a very explicit statement about the ban in April of 1847, long before Brigham Young made any explicit mention of it. He said, quote, "If people want to follow James J. Strang, go do it. If they want to follow this black man, i.e. William McCary, who's got the blood of Ham in him, which the lineage was cursed as regards to the priesthood, follow a new thing, hatch up, for we have only the old thing. It was old in Adam's day, it was old in Mormon's day, and hid up in the earth. It was old in 1830 when we first began to preach it." So the fourth point I would raise, there's new material in the George Q. Cannon diaries that is evidence that the priesthood ban was taught in Nauvoo. So in 2018, the entire George Q. Cannon journals were published for the first time online on the Church Historians Press website. In these publications, there are 4 statements by George Q. Cannon in his journal between 1895 and 1900. When controversy regarding the ban came up, he repeatedly mentions the ban was taught to him when he was a boy in Nauvoo by John Taylor as coming directly from Joseph Smith. And that's August 22nd, 1895, December 16th, 1897, March 1st, 1900, and March 18th, 1900. So I would say while we should be cautious about accepting late testimony, there are 2 decent external reasons to give George Q. Cannon's testimony credibility. Number 1, his testimony was compelling enough to both Joseph F. Smith and Lorenzo Snow to reverse their positions on the ban. So Lorenzo Snow seemed unsure about the ban, and he was wanting to bring it up as an issue. And then previously, Joseph F. Smith had been a champion for Elijah Abel, and up until the publication of the George Q. Cannon in diaries, historians didn't know why Joseph F. Smith changed his position by 1904 to be a firm advocate of the ban. And according to Cannon's journal, he said that Joseph F. Smith thanked him for sharing the information that he shared with them about being taught it in Nauvoo by John Taylor as coming from Joseph Smith. So the second reason you should give Cannon's testimony some weight is there is an 1845 statement by John Taylor in the Times and Seasons connecting racial curses with apostasy from the priesthood, which is supportive evidence that John Taylor believed in the ban in 1845. He wrote this, he said, quote, after the flood and after Ham had dishonored the holy priesthood, Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son Ham had done unto him. And as the priesthood descended from father to son, he delivered the following curse on Ham and blessings on Japheth and Shem, as translated by King James wise men and recorded in Genesis. History and common observation show that these predictions have been fulfilled to the letter. The descendants of Ham, besides a black skin, which has ever been a curse that has followed an apostate of the holy priesthood, as well as a black heart, have been servants to both Shem and Japheth, and the abolitionists are trying to make void the curse of God, but it will require more power than man possesses to counteract the decrees of eternal wisdom. So the fifth point I would raise is the Hiram Smith's patriarchal blessing to Jane Manning. So while many today would try to argue that Joseph Smith and Brigham Young identifying Africans as being the descendants of Cain and Ham was merely an uninspired cultural view, one big problem with this is that this was what patriarchal blessings for African members, revelation from God through the priesthood directed to individuals regarding themselves and their lineage, identified African individuals as being the lineage of Cain and Ham and Cain in the early church. And patriarchs up until very recently continued to do this. It's only been since the ban was lifted that they've actually counseled or encouraged or directed patriarchs to no longer give them this identification and to instead appoint them in a tribe of Israel, even though before they vast majority didn't do that. The only exception Walker Lewis got a patriarchal blessing from John Smith in early Utah that identified him as being a Canaanite descendant of Ham. And we have this patriarchal blessing that Hiram Smith gave to Jane Manning, saying identifying her as being a recipient of the lineage of Canaan through Ham, and then also of receiving the curse of Cain. Elijah Abel's patriarchal blessing just says he's an orphan, and he interestingly said that he was supposed to be a link between the white and black races. But that reference, it still wasn't identifying him with the tribe of Israel. It was identifying him as an orphan, possibly because of his mixed race status. So Hiram Smith gave Jane Manning a patriarchal blessing on March 6, 1844, telling her that she, quote, came down in the lineage of Canaan, the son of Ham, which promises the fullness thereof is not yet revealed. This statement suggests the Utah period understanding that the promises of the gospel were only given in part to Black individuals. And this is what Brigham Young said when he announced the priesthood ban. He said, quote, the African enjoys the right of receiving the first principles of the gospel. This liberty is held out to all these servants. They enjoy the liberty of being baptized for the remission of sins and of receiving the Holy Ghost by the laying on of hands, but they cannot hold the priesthood, and inasmuch as they can't bear any share in the priesthood, they cannot bear rule. They cannot bear rule in any place until the curse is removed from them. And going on, Jane being identified as the posterity of Cain and bearing Cain's curse was also apparent in the patriarchal blessing from Hiram, along with the promise that if she was righteous, she would eventually have the curse removed. The blessing said, behold, I say unto you, Jane, if thou doest well, thou shalt be accepted. If thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door, referencing the warning and conditional promise given to Cain in Genesis 4:7. Hiram also stated, quote, for he that changeth times and seasons and placed a mark upon your forehead can take it off and stamp upon you his own image. So according to the early Mormon doctrine, Brigham Young mentioned that they could have the curse removed. And so when would the curse be removed? In the resurrection. That's when Jane would, quote, have the curse taken off and be stamped upon in God's own image. So William Smith also taught the priesthood ban in his newspaper in February of 1845. So this is my sixth point. William Smith separated from the other apostles in 1845. He was barely even associated with them in the summer of 1845. He was back east for most of 1844 and early 1845. He came back in time in the early summer just to be ordained patriarch, and then he tried to wrestle control of the church from Brigham Young and ended up separating by the end of the summer. So he wasn't there for a whole lot of time. Yet in 1850, in his newspaper, Melchizedek and Aaronic Priest Herald published extracts from the book of Abraham to argue for chosen lineages and cursed lineages. And this is significant. So you can't say that he learned this from Utah Mormonism, because the comments that Brigham Young was making about it in 1847 and 1849 weren't yet published. But what's interesting is in this article, William Smith attempted to claim that Orson Hyde married a black man who married a white woman as a way to discredit the Brighamite Church. And this isn't true. There isn't really compelling evidence that Orson Hyde ordained William McCary. William McCary only mentioned being baptized. And spuriously, William Smith also called Brigham Young Brigham Young and alleged that Joseph Smith said that Brigham was, quote, of the lineage of Cain through the loins of Ham. So this is a very interesting thing that William wrote in this article. A Canaanite apostle then belongs to that class of spiritual beings that transgressed in heaven and became devils. So it's again referencing that cursed in the pre-existence doctrine. And if William Smith is referencing it, I think that's a compelling evidence that this concept went back to Joseph Smith. So he publishes the first two chapters of the book of Abraham. William's newspaper also included the following Q&A. Did Noah curse Ham as pertaining to the priesthood? Answer, see paragraph 42, paragraph 22, which is verse 26. Pharaoh, being a righteous man, established his kingdom and judged his people wisely and justly all his days, seeking earnestly to imitate that order established by the fathers in the first generations, in the days of the patriarchal reign, even in the reign of Adam, and also of Noah his father, who blessed him with the blessings of the earth and with the blessings of wisdom, but cursed him as pertaining to the priesthood. So another question, was the lineage of Ham cut off from the right of the priesthood? Answer, see paragraph 23, which is verse 27. Now, Pharaoh being of that lineage by which he could not have the right of the priesthood, notwithstanding the Pharaohs would fain claim it from Noah, although through Ham, therefore my father was led away by their idolatry. Question, was the posterity of Ham preserved? Did the posterity of Ham preserve a curse in the land? Answer, paragraph 20, verse 24. When this woman discovered the land, it was under water, and afterwards settled her sons in it, and thus from Ham sprang the race which preserved the curse in the land. Question, was the first Pharaoh king of Egypt the eldest son of Egyptus, the daughter of Ham? Answer, paragraph 31, verse 25. Now the first government of Egypt was established by Pharaoh, the eldest son of Egyptus, the daughter of Ham, and it was after the manner of government of Ham, which was patriarchal. Question, were the Egyptians called Canaanites? Answer, 18. From this descent sprang all the Egyptians, and thus the blood of the Canaanites was preserved in the land. So just to summarize, let's see, there we go. So just to summarize, first of all, Joseph Smith's revelations and teachings indicate a belief in the priesthood ban. 2, the apostles were teaching aspects of the priesthood ban doctrine in early 1845, less than a year after Joseph Smith's death. 3, there was no controversy when Brigham Young explicitly taught it in 1852. It had the united support of the other apostles. I would just add, if Brigham Young was deviating from Joseph Smith, Orson Pratt wasn't afraid to try to argue that like he did with Adam God. So if Brigham Young was deviating from Joseph Smith on racial ideas, then I would have expected Orson Pratt to have opposed him rather than sustain the same ideas. So 4, the George Q. Cannon between 1895 and 1900 wrote comments in his journal that 4 different comments that the doctrine had been taught to him as a boy in Nauvoo by John Taylor as coming from Joseph Smith. 5, Jane Manning's patriarchal blessing from Hiram Smith in March 1844 indicates that she was under the curse of Cain and curse of Ham, which lineages the promises were not fully revealed. And then last of all, William Smith advocated priesthood ban concepts in his newspaper Melchizedek and Aaronic Herald in February of 1850. All of these historical evidences, when put together, paint a compelling picture that Brigham Young's racial teachings he established in Utah had their origins with Joseph Smith in his teachings in Nauvoo.